Now that we've looked at the content of the blood itself, now we can take a look at what happens when we start to lose the blood, because the blood itself is only supposed to be in the blood vessels or the heart. And so if it is leaking out of there because we have damage to a blood vessel, we need to be able to stop that very quickly. So any kind of tissue damage that ends up damaging the blood vessels themselves. So here we have a case of a knife cutting through the blood vessel. This is going to cause a couple of things to start to occur. And so one of the first things that's going to occur is we're going to get smooth muscle contractions. We're going to get vasospasm, and that's going to cause the constriction of the blood vessel at the point of the damage itself. And then the next thing that's going to occur is that we're going to get a platelet plug forming. And so the platelets are going to form within that hole, in a sense, in the blood vessel, or at the end of the blood vessel that's there. And that's kind of just generic things that start to occur as those platelets start to bind up to the collagen fibers that are inside the opened vessel itself. That causes them to start to stick into that area. And then we're also going to have a series of essentially chemical reactions that occur that's going to lead to the final formation of the clot itself. So we're going to go run down a cascade of reactions that occurs that ultimately leads us to a protein called fibrin. And so when that first tissue occurs, we start to get the activation of a protein that's inside the blood called prothrombin. And so that prothrombin becomes activated by prothrombin activator. And that prothrombin then gets converted from prothrombin to thrombin. And then that thrombin becomes the next enzyme. And the thrombin then works on fibrinogen. And then fibrinogen is now going to become activated, and we're going to get to our final product, our fibrin. And so each one kind of activates an enzyme to the next enzyme, becomes the next enzyme, down this cascade of clotting processes that eventually leads us into the fibrin. And so this fibrin, now that we have, we're going to go from fibrin, which is dissolved inside the plasma. It's floating around. We can't see it. It's essentially just inactive at that point. But when it comes in contact with the thrombin, then it's going to, in a sense, be converted into fibrin. This fibrin now forms these long fibers that are inside there, and those fibers are going to start to crisscross as they've straightened out, and they're going to form a big net. That big net is then going to be able to capture red blood cells within there. It's going to be able to capture white blood cells inside there, and then it's going to capture platelets. And all of that's going to get stuck inside that mesh, and inside this mesh we now have this nice clot. And so we have this big fibrin structure. All the yellow fibers that we see here on the picture are stuck inside there. We've got some red blood cells, nice big red cells stuck inside there as well. We've got platelets that are stuck inside there. And then we've even got white blood cells that are stuck inside here as well, the big green one in the center there. And all of this is forming this big kind of structure that essentially plugs the hole. This is blocking the blood from being able to come out anymore and stops any more blood loss at that point. Now that we have this big hole there that's been plugged, the edges of the tissue need to be brought back together so that they come together, and we have what we call clot retraction. And so the clot has formed. We've got kind of this big, large structure that is surrounding our damage, and we're going to have to get the entire clot to start to pull things together. And so it's going to shrink, and as it does so, it's going to pull the edges in closer and closer, and that's going to allow for kind of the edges of the clot itself, or the damaged tissue, to start to heal and essentially start to come together in between the damage that's there. You can kind of think about a clot as somewhat similar to what we see on the outside of the body as kind of like a scab. And so that scab that's over there protects the surface, protects the tissues underneath, holds them together so that we can actually have the tissue eventually completely reformed underneath the clot itself. Eventually then, the clot is going to have to be removed. So we're going to have to remove that clot, and we're going to have enzymes that are going to start to break down the clot itself. So those enzymes are going to come in, they're going to dissolve the clot slowly so that we don't get pieces of that clot kind of just floating off back into the blood vessel and becoming something that is potentially dangerous for us. When we have a blood clot, that blood clot can form inside the vessel is in addition to being outside the vessel. So although we may see, in a sense, on that last slide, the portion that is actually outside the vessel, part of it may actually be inside the vessel. And when that occurs, we have what we call a thrombus. And so that thrombus is being pushed into by the blood as it's moving into it. And if it's not well adhered to the wall, so say that thrombus formed when we didn't necessarily have any damage to the vessel, so there was no damage there, and this simply just started to occur for a number of reasons. We can get that to happen, and we'll go through those in just a moment. But if that thrombus is not well adhered to it, it has the potential that it can actually slip away. And so it can actually leave the area that it was originally from and start to move along inside the blood vessels. Now we've got this kind of mass floating along inside the blood vessel, and we have what we call an embolus. So now that embolus is going to be able to go float along, and it's going to keep going until it essentially gets to a point where the blood vessel is too small. It's now too narrow for it to get through, and it gets stopped, and it gets, in a sense, clogged up. Now this area of the blood vessel is not going to be getting any blood supply. So wherever that blood was supposed to go, that part of the body now is being kept from having the oxygen and the nutrients that it needs to have. And now we can start to have some detrimental effects from it. If this stops in the brain or it stops in the heart, we're going to have something like a stroke or a heart attack potentially. So why do these form? They oftentimes form because there's something going on inside the vessel itself. And so inside the vessel, when we have something like atherosclerosis, we've got plaquing inside the vessel there. As the blood moves along, that blood has to slow down to get through the narrowed area of the vessel. And so the blood that's on the upstream end starts to form eddy currents. So it starts to kind of spin around and spin around. And as it does so, it can eventually start to form a clot. Blood that is not moving essentially starts to potentially form clots. And now that clot can either end up stuck inside here as it lets go, or maybe it continues on and goes and finds someplace else that it gets stuck as well. So this can be from slow moving blood. This can be from blood that hasn't been up and circulating very well. Somebody who's bedridden, somebody who is on a long plane flight, and the blood isn't moving very well because they're not up and moving. And it gets stuck into their lower limbs, their legs, and then when they get up and they start walking around, now the blood flow starts up again, because instead of having something like a sclerotic plaque, all they had was a blood vessel that was artificially narrowed because something was pushing on it. So something was pushing on it, just the pressure of their legs, something like that, and that caused this blood to kind of pool in behind it. And now as soon as they go to get up, that blood vessel opens wide up, and this clot isn't stuck to anything, so it's going to start to move on. And now all of a sudden they've reached their destination, and they were on the long plane flight, and now they get off the plane, and within a day or so now they've got a stroke or a heart attack or something like that going on as well. That's there. Other things can cause it as well. Trauma. And so we can have kind of a big trauma that has caused a huge amount of clotting factors to be released, things like that. From there, we can have imbalances in clotting, anticoagulating mechanisms that are in the body as well. And so we can have clotting factors that are either in abundance or those that are missing within the body as well. And the end result is going to be something like a stroke or a heart attack. We're going to end up having a situation where that blood gets to an area of the body, and once that clot gets to there, it forms in one of those vessels, and then that part of the brain or the heart or anywhere in the body is now going to be hypoxic. It's going to be losing its blood supply, and it's not going to get the nutrients that it needs in order to survive. This can even happen in the legs, the arm, anywhere really in the body itself where that clot may be settled. And within that, even though it is there, we think of the brain and the heart as being kind of the most detrimental, but it's going to be detrimental in a sense really no matter where it goes. So when we look at the causes of a heart, oftentimes, where we start to get problems there is oftentimes we have plaquing in the vessels. And so we look at our coronary arteries here. And so we have our anterior interventricular artery coming down the front of the heart there. And if that plaquing is occurring, that blood flow again behind the plaque is going to be kind of slowed, and it has the potential to eventually form a clot. And if that clot then gets into the area where the plaquing is and gets stuck, then it's going to completely block the blood flow out to that area of the heart. And it doesn't always have to come from that area of the heart itself. And so normally we think of coronary artery disease as being the cause, and oftentimes it is, but again, it could come from someplace else in the body where that clot actually formed in the first place, in a sense. That's there. And so next time we'll start to continue to look at the endocrine system.